Hi guys, Olive here today to discuss my top fiction books of 2024. I enjoyed a number of great works of fiction throughout 2024, but there were 5 standouts, 5 books that really impressed me and stood out amongst all the others, and those are the ones I want to talk about today. I have ranked them, and I'm going to be working in reverse order, so I'll start off by talking about my 5th favorite, and then work my way up to talking about my number 1 favorite novel of the entire year. And I will give my yearly disclaimer that these are simply the books that I read in 2024. They weren't necessarily published this year. At that number 5 spot is The Modern Fairies by Claire Pollard, a work of historical fiction set in Paris during the reign of the Sun King. A group of intellectual storytellers regularly hold meetings to tell each other stories, or fairy tales. And these stories are meant to covertly communicate their frustrations with society without getting in trouble with the crown. And those stories also have their roots in tales that they all had heard from female figures in their earlier lives, like their maids or their nannies. Many of the stories they tell within this novel will feel familiar to you, and that's because one of the founding fathers of fairy tales is a character in this book, as are many other true-to-life historical figures whose plot lines in this novel don't stray too far from the scandalous realities of their actual lives. And I think that was actually one of the most satisfying parts of reading this novel. It's about making up stories, but this author did not need to make up a whole lot in order to make this dramatic, or should I say melodramatic. The writing in here is decadent. I mean, this cover being filled with confections is beyond appropriate. It's a rather short book. It flew by, but I was rapt the entire time, and when I finished, it felt like I had stepped out of a fever dream. The number 4 book on my list was equally as absorbing, albeit in a very different way. It's Here in the Dark by Alexis Solowsky. This is a thriller, but it's also kind of in the style of a noir, although it does depart from that genre in that it has a female main character. She is a theater critic. She is known for being, let's say, extremely harsh on the shows that she reviews. And right at the start of this novel, we see her get interviewed for some sort of a theater magazine. The interview itself is weird. The vibes are off. And then we find out, not soon after she takes this interview, that the man who interviewed her has gone missing, and she was the last person to see him alive. I say that this book feels like a noir because it becomes clear in just a matter of pages that this theater critic is extremely self-destructive. And that becomes even more evident when she begins to investigate this interviewer's disappearance. She wants to find out what happened to him, and she does so increasingly at her own expense, and she becomes more and more detached from reality the deeper she gets into this case. This book is just a whole mood. It is dark, it is tense, it's acerbic and cutting one moment, raw and vulnerable the next. I mean, it's broody in the way that noirs typically are, but in a distinctly feminine way, like a dark feminine way. And it has a very unlikable female main character, which I think is partially why this is not everyone's favorite thriller, if average ratings on Goodreads are to be trusted anyway. It did captivate me, however, and it seems to have delivered exactly what the author intended. It's also particularly good on audiobook if you like audiobooks, because the narrator is Broadway performer Laura Benanti, and it just really adds to the experience. But get ready for the tone to shift pretty drastically as we move into book number 3, because this upcoming book is as lighthearted as the previous book was heavy. It's The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love by India Holton, a book in which adventure meets romance meets fantastical birds as 2 rival scientists compete with each other and a host of other bird lovers to capture a rare fictional bird in England because they will win a spectacular prize if they succeed in doing so. As our 2 main characters are hunting down this bird, they seem to keep getting pushed together. And as such, they begrudgingly start to work with one another, and 2 things begin to happen. Number 1, they begin to fall for one another. But number 2, they begin to get the sense that something is really odd about this competition, which we as readers, getting a whole sense of the situation, know to be true, and that creates some very satisfying dramatic irony. Being a bird lover myself, there were moments as I was reading this that I felt, completely illogically, I recognized that this book was intended for me specifically. It is a very silly book, but it's also thrilling and it's romantic. I just had the biggest grin on my face the entire time I was reading this. It's another example of how I feel this author knew exactly what she wanted this to be and then really swung for the fences, and it's a hit. I am beyond excited that this is the start of a new series. But now on to fiction book number 2 on my list, but I would say it's number 1 if we're talking in terms of the surprise factor, because I did not expect to love The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, a book I read as part of my long-running Wishbone series. I would read the novels that the 1990s PBS Kids show would adapt for their episodes, and then I would compare those books to the episodes themselves and see how they compared. I read so many classics as part of covering those episodes, but it wasn't until I was almost done with the series that the show introduced me to what is now a new favorite. This is a work of historical fiction written by the famous American novelist Mark Twain, but this is so unlike any of his other works. He spent 12 years researching the life of the famous female teenage warrior Joan of Arc, and then he spent an additional 2 years writing this adoring account of her life. And I mean it. Mark Twain adored her. You will definitely get that sense as you go through all of the victories, the struggles, the tragedies of her far too short life in this novel that is widely considered to be quite historically accurate. Twain even considered this book his best novel, and even though I haven't yet read each and every one of his books, I already want to agree with him, if only because of that love and care that he generously poured into the writing of this book, because you can feel it. This book is so spirited. It's inspiring and heartwarming, even as it is devastating and heartbreaking. It's now one of my favorite classics. I will forever be grateful to Wishbone for so much, and bringing this book into my life is now at the top of that list. Now, though, it is time to talk about my favorite fiction read of 2024, and it actually came along right at the end of the year. I spent most of 2024 believing that Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc was going to be my top novel of the year, but then this book came along. And I definitely had a feeling of, oh, so that's where you've been this entire year. It's Eleanor of Avignon by Elizabeth de Lazier. This is another work of historical fiction, except this one follows a fictional main character, but who is living during a very real time period and set of historical circumstances in medieval Europe. Our heroine in this book is, of course, Eleanor. She is one of 2 twin daughters of a medicine woman, an herbalist, who was very good at what she did, and of course was then accused of witchcraft at one point. But prior to the events of this novel, their mother had died in childbirth. We do find out that prior to her mother's death, Eleanor was learning the crafts of herbalism and midwifery from her mother. But at the time we meet her, Eleanor's twin sister Margot is getting ready to be married. Margot wants Eleanor to get married as well, since that would provide some protection for her. But Eleanor wants more for her life, even if she, as a woman, knows better than to dream big. But then she has a chance run-in with the private physician to the Pope, and she eventually impresses him enough to become his apprentice. And later on, they work together to investigate the illness that we now know as the plague as it erupts in their city. They're trying to learn more about it, learn how to treat it, how to contain it, hopefully. And then even later on in this novel, she becomes the midwife to the disgraced Queen of Naples when she comes into town. I tore through this book in one day. I was completely unable to stop myself from inhaling this book. The world that she created here is so vivid. The characters are so well-rounded and so easy to care about. Even as I couldn't put this book down, I think I knew it was going to be my favorite of the year because I got that old familiar feeling that the moment I finished it, I was going to miss it so much. I was going to miss living in this world. Then something happened right at the end of this book that first had my heart racing. My Fitbit even told me that my heart rate spiked. It was like my cardio for the day. And then something happens that is so devastating, but also relieving, like at the same time. Just a whole roller coaster ride of emotions and reactions with this book. And I loved every single second of it. There's also all of these different historical lessons to be learned from a time period that I previously knew next to nothing about, so I was learning at the same time, which if you know anything about me, you know is my kryptonite. So this is really just the perfect book for me. 10 out of 10, 0 notes, my favorite of the year for sure. So those were my favorite novels of 2024. I would love to hear what works of fiction impressed you most this year. Are you interested in reading any of my favorites? Please let me know any or all of that down in the comment section below. All of the books that I did discuss today will be listed and linked for you in the description box below for your clicking convenience. And at the very bottom of the exact same description box, you will also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets. So my Goodreads, Instagram, the Story Graph, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I'm reading and doing right now. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.